Hi friends, Prepared Suburbanite here. I got a comment recently on sort of a recent video from a person, we'll call her Elizabeth. And here's what she had to say. I want to start prepping just because I've always felt it's better to be safe than sorry. And we do live in scary times, and that's for sure. I just want to be able to keep my family safe, but at the same time, I'm afraid to talk to my husband about it because the one time I tried to bring it up, he brushed it off as being paranoid and gullible. And I don't need him thinking I'm crazy. So what I need to know is how to go about prepping without causing friction. I'm going to try to answer Elizabeth's question right after this. All right, first I think we got to make sure that we're on the same page, Elizabeth, with respect to what you mean by prepping. You say you want to start prepping, but I'm not sure what that means. So let me just go back into my thought processes and share some ideas with you. First of all, prepping is not bushcrafting. It's not camping out in the woods and starting a fire and building a tarp out of evergreen branches and things like that. That's not what prepping is. Prepping is not survivalism like you see on the Alone TV show on the History Channel or the Les Stroud Survivor Man shows that you see on the History Channel and others. It's not doomsday preppers where folks are living in underground bunkers and they've got war rooms and all that kind of stuff. That's not what prepping is. It's not homesteading. Homesteading's entirely different than being a prepper, being prepared. So what is prepping? To me, it's being self-sufficient, it's being frugal, it's being resourceful, and it's having and learning skills that will allow you to survive and thrive in bad times. So let's take a look at some of those kinds of things. I think we've got to go back to the rule of threes. And there's a lot of different variation on the rule of threes. But let's take it in the broadest concept that I can find out there. First of all, the rule of three says 3 seconds without hope. That means don't panic. If something happens, maintain your sanity, maintain your hope. Don't panic, don't freeze, don't go into a fear mode. That's not going to help you. That's kind of optional. If you've gone through some prep and you've gone through some training, chances are you're already going to know what your first steps are going to be. So you're going to bypass the 3 seconds without hope kind of a scenario. But the next one, 3 minutes without air. Now, if you jump into a lake and you get stuck underneath the water, you've got 3 minutes or less to free yourself to get back up to the surface so you can gulp some air. If the water or the air is contaminated, nuclear fallout, biologicals, whatever can happen, you're going to need some kind of face protection because 3 minutes ain't very long. So that's the first rule of three, is 3 minutes without air. 3 hours without shelter. Now, we're not talking about staying at the Marriott Resort. That's not the shelter we're talking about. We're talking about the right kind of clothing. We're talking about staying dry. If you're wet and you're wearing cotton and you're out and it's 40 or 45 degrees, you're going to be in trouble in less than 3 hours. I know, I've been there, I've done that, and it's no fun. So 3 hours without shelter, be thinking that it's not your house, it's not your tent, it's the clothing that you wear, and it's the condition that your body's been exposed to in the environment. If you're wet, go get dry. And you've got 3 hours to take care of that. 3 days without water. You can basically survive without a drink of water for 3 days. After 2 days, you're going to be hurting. After 3 days, you're probably not going to be doing real well at all. In fact, you may be doubled over in pain. You may be on the edge of death. But 3 days without water. So make sure that that's part of your definition of prepping. 3 weeks without food. If you've got shelter and if you've got water, you can survive for 3 weeks without food. Oh, sure, you're going to lose weight. Oh, sure, you're going to be hungry. Oh, sure, it's not going to be a pleasant experience, but you can survive minimal for 3 weeks without food. Keep that in mind. 3 weeks isn't very long if we're up against the big SHTF event. And then the other, I guess the last point of contention with the rule of threes is 3 months without companionship, hope, and love. I've watched enough episodes of Alone to realize that the folks that tap out there, tap out for the most part, unless they're injured, they tap out because they can't stand being alone for such an extended period of time. 50 days, 60 days, 70 days, they're tapping out because they can't figure out how to exist day to day without love, without companionship. I guess the other example would be the Castaway movie from Tom Hanks, where he got stranded on a desert island there, and he had the soccer ball that looked like that he called Wilson and all that. His whole motivation was companionship. His whole motivation was love to get himself off that island. So the rule of threes comes into play here. And because we're not talking about bushcrafting, survivalism, the doomsday prepper, that kind of a thing, let's talk about what prepping really should be for you. It's self-sufficiency. It's frugality. It's resourcefulness. And it's skills and learning new skills. So the subject of this particular video is, can you get started prepping without your spouse being on board? And you know what? That really is me, but not for the reason that you think. And let me explain what I mean by that as I kind of delve into the history and my journey into being a prepper. And I'm proud of being a prepper, by the way. So, here we go. My wife was the prepper for the first 20 years, at least, maybe even more, of our marriage. Now, she was born and raised on a 300-acre farm in northern Pennsylvania. And I guess some folks would describe them as being land-poor farmers. The land was beautiful. It was a mix of farmland and woodlots. The farm itself, they had chickens, they had draft horses, they had, I think they had a goat, no, they had sheep for a short period of time. They had dairy cattle, milk cows. And there was 7 kids in the family. She had 3 older brothers and 3 younger sisters, and my wife was right smack dab in the middle. Growing up in a rural, very rural environment without a lot of money kind of forces people to really be frugal, self-sufficient, and basically inventive. I watched my mother-in-law plant a garden, harvest the garden, can the vegetables that came out of that garden. I watched her make bread, an enormous amount of bread to feed 7 kids in the house. Now, I didn't come along until she was past the child-rearing ages, basically, but I heard stories that she'd have to bake 6 or 7 loaves of bread every other day. And this wasn't just like simple bread baking. This was using a bread kneader that you had to churn and churn and churn and churn and churn, churn and let it rise and break it up into loaves and let it rise in the pan and then bake it in the oven for however many minutes you got to bake it, and then cut it up and use that to make the sandwiches to let the kids take their lunch to school, all that. And the kids were actually somewhat embarrassed about having to eat homemade bread when they couldn't get store-bought bread, because store-bought bread cost 30 cents a loaf and you could make homemade bread for much, much cheaper. Just kind of the way things were. But I've seen what happens in the psyche, the way people approach issues, the way they approach problems, and how they were brought up. In a situation like my wife's upbringing, they didn't have a lot, but they had everything. Now, does that make sense? No, they didn't have a lot of material goods. They didn't have a lot of material wealth, but what they did have far surpassed that. They were encouraged to be frugal, encouraged to be self-sufficient. They were loved. They were cared for. There were sacrifices made that taught lessons throughout all those kids, all her brothers and all her sisters. Just absolutely amazing what that upbringing brought to her. She is very, very frugal. She is very, very self-sufficient. She's very creative. She knows how to can. She knows how to garden. She brought those skills with her to our marriage because she learned them as a kid and perfected them as a teenager. She was helping her mom baking the bread. She was helping her mom canning the corn and canning the green beans and whatever else came out of the gardens. She knew how to do all that stuff before we even got married. At the time, I had no idea that you could even do any of that kind of stuff. But hanging around with her family during the first few years of our marriage, on a 300-acre mixed woodlot farm in northern Pennsylvania with 3 older brothers who loved to hunt, who loved to fish, who loved being in tune with nature. I spent an awful lot of time out in those woods with her brothers, learning how to hunt, learning how to shoot a rifle, learning how to sight one in, learning how to shoot a shotgun, and learning how to hunt, how to harvest a deer, how to cut up a deer, how to package that deer so that you've got food for the winter. Pretty much really great skills to have. But I still wasn't a prepper. And my wife and I were sitting here before we started filming this video, trying to figure out what was the trigger? What was the event that caused us to really embrace prepping as a lifestyle? So the triggering event, I think, for me, as we were trying to go through our memories and try to say, yeah, that was it. That's what really did it. But for me personally, it was the 2008 election. Yeah, the 2008 election when Barack Obama became our president. I didn't understand exactly what that was all about. I had sort of crossed paths with him. I did some consulting work when I was out in the Chicago area, and everybody that I talked to out in the Chicago area before the election, everything was so super positive about this guy. Creative thinker, problem solver, really got involved in the issues in the community, really knew what he was doing, got elected state senator, and then from there got elected to the U.S. Senate from Illinois, kind of representing, really drawing from the Chicago crowd there. But the folks that I was working with and I was talking to just thought he was the greatest thing since sliced bread. Well, when he became president, I was a little concerned because it represented a big shift in political thinking. And I was concerned that being a conservative and knowing that he was not a conservative, that we would be having quite a number of differences in our approaches and problem solving and all that. But I became pretty concerned when I saw his programs and his policies being unveiled after he became president. I really did get concerned. In 2012, when he got reelected, my thoughts were, oh my God, the American public just backed the Titanic up and rammed the iceberg on purpose, and we're going to sink the ship. Well, the economy was not doing real well. Foreign policy, at least in my opinion, was not doing real well. Domestic policy was not doing real well. And thankfully, we do have term limits for the president. So I stuck with it for those 4 years, 2012 through 2016, and was hoping and was going to vote for anybody but the Democratic candidate. And then Donald Trump came along. Well, during the Obama administration, that's when I started truly embracing being a prepper. I got things organized. I looked at the basics and said, what do we really have to do here to make sure that if the political climate, from my perspective, if the political climate gets in such disarray that we'll be invaded by a foreign adversary, that we'll do something really incredibly stupid economically that could cause the markets to crash and all that. There was a lot of things going on that I just didn't feel comfortable with. Well, I looked around at what I had. I looked around at what my wife had and what she had been doing, and I realized that it was really time to get started prepping. But for me, the trigger was the political environment. Talking to my wife before we started producing this video, talking with her, she's always been a prepper. So the trigger for her really wasn't an individual event or a change in society, anything like that. She's always been a prepper. She's always been frugal. She's always stockpiled stuff that a lot of people don't even think about doing. Extra food, extra water, little bit of this, little bit of that, plastic bags, matches, candles, batteries. Those are the kinds of things that she'd stockpile, and we'd have them in reserve. Didn't think too much about it. It was like, yeah, well, okay, so we got some extra batteries in the drawer there. That's cool. But in 2003, we had here in North Carolina an ice storm that was probably the most devastating thing for this particular area that they've seen around here in a long, long time. Ice built up on the trees and pulled down big trees and limbs, knocked out the power all around the whole area. It was days and days and days and days before the power could get restored. I was out of town. In fact, I was up in New England doing consulting work, and made my way back home and found that we didn't have any power, that the whole backyard out here was knee deep in broken branches from the pine trees and the maple trees and the sweet gum trees that are filled up the backyard. It was truly a mess. There was no power for days. My grandkids were all like 2 to 2.5 years old, and everybody gathered at our place to ride out the storm. We didn't have any power. We didn't have any electricity. We had a little bit of extra food, but it was cold. It was winter. And trying to keep a bunch of little babies warm, we didn't have enough extra firewood to even keep the fires going in the fireplace. So that was, I think, my wife's sentinel or triggering event was never going to do that again. We're getting a generator. We're going to make sure we've got some firewood as backup for that fireplace. We're going to make sure that we've got some extra water. We're going to make sure that we've got some extra food around, just in case it happens again. And as we incorporated those needs, my fears about the political climate and the national politics and world politics and the threats that we've been exposed to over time, and even reaching back to, the World Trade Center and the Iranian hostage taking back in the 70s and the oil embargoes and all that. We've never been 100% truly safe in this country because there's a lot of extra stuff going on. This is not new. It's going to be with us forever. And what we need to be is prepared to deal with it when it crosses the line. So, Elizabeth, I know you want to get started prepping. There isn't any reason that you should not. Your husband may not agree with you, and it may be because he believes that prepping is what he saw on Doomsday Preppers, that maybe it's what he saw on Alone. Maybe it's some other thinking pattern that, because I don't know you and I don't know your husband, but I would venture to guess that his concept of prepping is different than mine. Mine is simply being ready for anything. If the power goes out for 2 days, do we have enough food? Do we have enough water? Do we have enough shelter, heat, lights, that kind of a thing? Can we make it through those kinds of intermediate disruptions in normal life? That's where we need to start. There isn't any reason that when you go to the grocery store, Elizabeth, that you can't pick up a couple extra cans of tomatoes, a couple extra cans of green beans, a couple extra cans of whatever foods it is that your family enjoys eating, and just pick up a couple extra cans here and there, here and there, here and there, and let it pile up in your larder. rotate that stock out as time goes by, which is a normal requirement of being prepared, is that you do have to rotate some of that stock. But there's nothing that says you can't just begin stockpiling that kind of stuff. Bottled water, great to have in backup if all of a sudden your water systems are contaminated, your water systems are powered down, however you get your water. If you live in a city, it could be a city kind of a thing. There could be contaminants in there. It's happened around this area a couple of different times where, they've got, you got to boil your water, you got to do this, you got to do that. Or if you live in an area where you've got to be reliant on the power grid to power your pumps to get the water, and the power goes down, you don't have any water. The bottled water, it may not be the greatest thing in the world, and yeah, there's a lot of weird issues that folks talk about the plastic bottles and the leaching of the chemicals in those bottles. But you can get 2 flats, 24 bottles of water, 14 or 16 ounce bottles of water. You can get like 2 flats of that for $5 or $6. So pick up a couple of flats this week, a couple of flats a couple weeks from now, a couple extra things here, extra bag of flour there, extra pork and beans, extra chicken soup, extra whatever, and just begin your food preps. That's where I'd start, is with the food preps and the water preps, assuming that you've got a home already, you've got the shelter thing sort of taken care of. You just got to make sure that you've got the right kind of clothes for everybody. We're not going to get into bugging in and bugging out and SHTF scenarios, but if you want to get started prepping, there isn't any reason that you can't do it alone, by yourself. Just get started. And then, if the event does happen, where 6 months from now, 8 months from now, a year from now, you lose power for a week, and you've got extra water, you've got extra food, you've got extra this, extra that, you've got a means to cook it that's off-grid, basically, a propane stove for, like, if you maybe do camping, you pick up one of the Coleman propane stoves. Well, yeah, you can prepare a meal on that. You've got maybe a grill out in your backyard or on the patio or on the deck, and it's got propane in it. You can cook out there. So you've got to think about those kinds of innovative options that you can have if you're facing a grid down situation. But if you can make it through a grid down situation because you've got some minimal things prepared just in case, that's when you need to sit down and kind of talk to your husband about, hey, we made it through this 4-day period without the grid, without power, without water, because I put a few extra things away. I made sure that we had some extra propane tanks. I made sure that we had a Coleman stove. I made sure that we had a few extra flats of water so that we could wash our dishes, drink the water, maintain our hygiene. Those are the kinds of things that spark the discussion that you need to have. I wouldn't try to convince them that you need to live in a bunker. I wouldn't try to convince them that you need to try out for the next episodes or the next season of the Alone Survival series. But be prepared. It's as simple as that. This is the Prepared Suburbanite reminding you to be prepared always, and I'll see you all on the next video.